Burnt Toast!
Hello and welcome to tonight's album Spotlight on the Burnt Toast Show. Hope you're enjoying the show so far if you're watching the playlist. We're going to talk about Eugene McDaniels tonight, the singer-songwriter Eugene McDaniels. Who? Yeah, Eugene McDaniels. This is a good story and I hope you dig it. We're going to talk about an album called Headless Heroes of the Apocalypse. Came out in 1971 for a while. I'll explain that later. Interesting cover here with Eugene McDaniels and Samurai. And the album itself being called Headless Heroes of the Apocalypse. That's a pretty heavy title. On the back of the album, we've got a little quote. The Left Rev McD is what he called himself at that time. Kind of I guess he thought of himself as a very liberal preacher. We have killed the very earth beneath our feet, and yet we still kill each other and speak of the future. Okay. Well, let's talk about this album. It was produced by Joel Dorn. It was on Atlantic Records. That's really important. Atlantic Records. It was produced by Joel Dorn, who had worked with Roberta Flack, Max Roach, Bette Midler, the Allman Brothers Band, Yusef Lateef, the Neville Brothers, Herbie Mann, Les McCann, another person we're going to pay a lot of attention to coming up, Mose Allison, and Rahsaan Roland Kirk, all of whom came through Atlantic Records. And Joel Dorn was a great producer. You think about Tom Dowd working for Atlantic Records, Jerry Wexler. Joel Dorn was another great producer for Atlantic Records back in the 1960s and 70s. They had a real great operation happening there. Those Aretha Franklin records. They had Crosby, Stills and Nash. They had Led Zeppelin. They had Stax was a subsidiary, so that means that was Otis Redding, Ray Charles, of course. Really great label. I want to say that first off because
things get ugly
for Atlantic Records on this album. In the early 60s, Eugene McDaniels was signed to Liberty Records, and they were trying to sell him as like another Sam Cooke or something like that. And he called himself Gene instead of Eugene. That's important as well, because he basically changed his identity some years later. And he was with Liberty for a few years. He had two really, really big hits. He was discovered by Liberty Records singing jazz with the Les McCann Trio, a real close friend of his. The two friends that really did the most for him, I think, are Les McCann and Roberta Flack, both piano players who had very successful careers of their own. But Liberty Records thought, hey, that we could work with this guy. And he had two big hits in 1961, 100 Pounds of Clay, Tower of Strength, which was a Burt Bacharach composition. And they both went gold in 1961. I don't remember either one of those songs. I really had to refresh on that. But at that time, he was very big. And he continued on. He was unable to repeat the success of those songs. But by the late 60s, he had turned his attention to the civil rights movement and protest music, politically charged protest music. He wrote a song that was covered by his friend Les McCann on an album called Swiss Movement, which was a live album that Les McCann did with Eddie Harris at the Montreux Jazz Festival. It came out in 1969. A song called Compared to What? And this was very politically charged. And there's stuff in there I still don't know if people would be comfortable with. And that was a motif that Eugene McDaniels, who called himself now Eugene McDaniels, was the kind of poking at you a little bit. How comfortable are you? You think you're comfortable? You think you're liberal? You know, maybe you are, maybe you're not. That was an interesting place to be in, and it was not an unpopular place to be in 1969. You could kind of do that, depending on who you were. And that song has been recorded, Compared to What has been recorded by Ray Charles, John Legend and the Roots, and Roberta Flack, among many, many others. Brian Auger did that song, who we played earlier in the show. That song was also on the first Roberta Flack album. She recorded that song as well. And so Atlantic signed him. And they thought that they were signing, well, I don't know what they thought they were signing, because Compared to What is very pointed in its narrative. And yet, here was this guy who had big hits in the early 60s, big hits. I don't know whether they were surprised or not, but the first album was a little different album. It was an album called Outlaw from 1970. On the cover, you have Eugene McDaniels in a cowboy hat with a gun, flanked by two women, one white and one black, also bearing guns. And in the time of the underground movements, this was kind of a scary thing for some listeners, I would assume. That album was very different. And on the back of it, he wrote this: under conditions of national emergency, like now, there are only two types of people: those who will work for freedom and those who do not. The good guys versus the bad guys. And this was around the time he started calling himself the Left Rev McD. Like I say, it was an interesting album. It was very influenced by like Bob Dylan and folk singers a little bit more than the Headless Heroes. That was sort of a fully realized album. They asked him at that time, what his motivation was. And he said, I'm not here to make money. I'm here to have fun and tell the truth. And on that album, there were some interesting tracks, but like I say, it was a little more folk-oriented. Roberta Flack played piano, the most recorded bass player of all time. Ron Carter played bass, Ray Lucas on the drums, Buck Clark from Les McCann's band on the percussion, Eric Weisberg and Hugh McCracken on guitar. Eric Weisberg and Hugh McCracken were session musicians. Hugh McCracken played guitar both on Brown Eyed Girl by Van Morrison and Hey 19 by Steely Dan. It didn't really go over that well. There was a track on there. There were politically based tracks like The Silent Majority that was covered by a few folks, but not many. And then there was a track called Love Letter to America that was kind of anything but. The song that most sounded like Headless Heroes was a track called Cherry Stones. It was sort of a harbinger of things to come for Eugene McDaniels. There was also a song on there called Reverend Lee that was a pretty successful song that was covered by Roberta Flack on her next album as well. When he got to the second album, he had some real fiery material. There was some very fiery material, very politically motivated. And that's not unusual. At that same time, this gentleman, Gil Scott-Heron, put out his first album, Pieces of a Man. And the very first song on this album, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. We'll follow up with that because I got some questions for how Gil stayed free of what happened to Eugene McDaniels. And they're both brilliant. Gil Scott-Heron's one of my all-time favorites, but they're both brilliant. But just to quote the title track, nobody knows who the enemy is because he never goes into hiding. He's slitting our throats right in front of our eyes while we pull the casket he's riding. Better get it together and see what's happening. Okay, all right, that's not I love you, do you love me too? And so he was going definitely for a more radical, I don't know if it's radical, but it was a very, very political stance on these songs, which I'll run down one at a time. The band on this is exceptional. The guitarist named Richie Resnikoff was a session player, but really transcendent guitar playing on this, and a really original sound from Richie Resnikoff. The keyboards and arrangements were by Harry Whitaker, who did a great album called Black Renaissance a few years later, and he was at that time a member of the Roy Ayers Ubiquity. He actually wrote the song We Live in Brooklyn, Baby, which is an all-time classic for Roy Ayers. Alphonse Mouzon was on the drums. He played with Weather Report at that time. He was the drummer with Weather Report, really great underrated drummer. He also played on Les McCann's Invitation to Openness. He played later with McCoy Tyner, Larry Coryell's 11th House, and he had a great solo career that included a great album called Mind Transplant from 1975. The bass player, they had two actually. The bass player was Miroslav Vitus, a great acoustic bass player who at that time was also the bass player with Weather Report, which was a newly founded band, so not a lot of people knew about that yet. He did an album that's been re-released in various forms, various titles really, called Infinite Search or Mountain in the Clouds. And that was a real amazing album. Joe Henderson, John McLaughlin, Jack DeJohnette, and Herbie Hancock were on that album, so it was kind of a legendary album. Those gentlemen were joined by Gary King on electric bass and Carla Cargill, who I've never heard anything anywhere else, but a great vocalist, and she makes for some very odd harmonies with Eugene McDaniels. And his approach was not a tight, extremely produced thing. It was more like a jazz singer. There are two songs about spirituality that I think are two of the best songs on the album. The Lord Is Back, the opening song, and Lovin' Man. And both of these songs sort of hint toward the idea that if Jesus returned, he would not be the hero that a lot of people think of him as now. I think that he was, I don't know if he was one of the first to suggest that, but it's definitely suggested here that Jesus would be looked upon as a troublemaker, perhaps. Those are great songs. The second song is called Jagger the Dagger. It's an interesting, well, of course, Jagger is Mick Jagger, and this is in the wake of Altamont, the concert in December in the San Francisco area that sort of, quote unquote, killed the hippie dream. And you can look that up. They had done a song, the Rolling Stones had done a song called Sympathy for the Devil. And that got a lot of people thinking that maybe Mick Jagger was in the service of the devil. That was suggested also in the song American Pie around that time by Don McLean, and it's definitely suggested here. And it's definitely about the death of the hippie dream and the ideology, sort of all thrust upon and blamed one person, Mick Jagger.
We're splitting, man, if those cats don't stop beating everybody up inside. I want them out of the way.
That might not be fair, but there you go. The third song is the title track, Headless Heroes of the Apocalypse. And that was an especially striking indictment of the politics in America, the culture of America, and the power being more important than making the country better. And I quoted some of that up front. And that was a really, really fiery, no punches pulled kind of statement for him to make. After that, we heard a song that might have belonged better on the Outlaw album called Susan Jane, more of an acoustic thing. And it was definitely not as politically motivated as the rest of the album. It was, I mean, it talked about how women were becoming more free. And the things that you notice about this are his interest in civil rights, women's rights, the rights of Native Americans, and the political oppression in the culture, which was not unusual at that time, but it was unusual for someone in his position. After Susan Jane, we go to side 2 for the song called Freedom Death Dance, which is a takeoff on the Eddie Harris composition Freedom Jazz Dance. It's sort of a call to arms for the hippie generation. And the idea is that no amount of dancing will save us. The next song is Supermarket Blues, one of the earliest song examples of racial profiling. It's about racism in America and an incident at a grocery store. The album closes with a song called Parasite that is about the genocide of Native Americans. And it's another really scathing indictment of our culture and American leadership and the idea that it's always been marked by lies and careless destruction. The song and the album end with a extremely free jazz and screaming, which is to me totally fearless and uncommercial and a very unusual way to end an album. It just really is such an incredible statement. I'm not sure that if you listen to this album, you'll get the whole thing right away. It's a very unique sounding album. I love the band, especially Alphonse Mouzon's drumming and Harry Whitaker is playing and Richie Resnikoff. Now we're going to talk about what happened afterwards. We're talking about 1971. So the president was Richard Nixon. He had some problems with people. He believed that cannabis made you liberal. That was his first one. So he invented the DEA. He was very worried about the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and people who spoke out against him. He didn't like that. And his vice president was Spiro Agnew. And Spiro Agnew, at some point, came to the president of Atlantic Records, Ahmet Ertegun, who was an immigrant from Istanbul, demanded that the album be taken off of out of the shelves, out of the stores, and that Eugene McDaniels be blacklisted. And usually, Ahmet Ertegun was art first. And for a long time, I wondered what was it that made him pull that? What was it? And then I realized that Ahmet Ertegun was from Istanbul. And at that time, Richard Nixon was trying to deport John Lennon. He had files on, Timothy Leary had already been arrested. Eldridge Cleaver had already been arrested. Abby Hoffman was living underground as Barry Freed. He was ineffective. They'd taken all that away. He had files on Jane Fonda, Paul Newman, Barbra Streisand, Grace Slick. I think that Ahmet Ertegun, the thing to think about is that Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young did things maybe not as pointed, but in particular the songs Ohio and Chicago by that group were pretty politically pointed against Nixon and the current administration, the cultural leaders. And the difference was that they were rock stars who made lots and lots of money, and they had amazing sway over their followers, and that actually would have brought a lot of unwanted attention to the fact that they tried to take that stuff off the shelves. This guy was just a jazz singer, and he's doing this album that, making people think thoughts that Nixon didn't want them to think. So Spiro Agnew insisted that the album be taken off the shelves, and Ahmet Ertegun went along with him. Eugene McDaniels really never came back from that as a recording artist. He did continue to write songs, and he produced and wrote a song called Feel Like Making Love for Roberta Flack in 1974. That was an enormous hit and was nominated for a Grammy, and that sort of took care of him for the rest of his life. In the 1990s, DJs started to discover these albums, like DJs in clubs, DJs who worked with rappers, started to discover this album, and it's one of the most sampled in history. Some of the more famous groups that sampled it back in the day were the Tribe Called Quest, Beastie Boys, Pete Rock, De La Soul, and Quasimodo. So, rediscovered. It was like the revolution came back around. And even though Eugene McDaniels never did, he lived sort of a self-described hermit existence in Maine and passed away in 2011. But he did see the resurgence of this album, resurgence and appreciation. Interestingly enough, it was re-released in July of 2021 for its 50th anniversary edition. It was released only on vinyl by Atlantic Records, and a lyric sheet was included inside. So maybe they got over it too. Eugene McDaniels, Headless Heroes of the Apocalypse. That's our album feature for tonight, and I hope to talk to you again soon. Hope you enjoyed it. This is the Burnt Toast Show, and I'm your host, Todd Harold. Thank you.